Hi everyone. So I wanted to do a pretty brief video on the data visualization code that we kind of went over in class. Um, I hope that for some of you, this will kind of go back over some of the kind of lessons that we learned in class. For others of you, this should be kind of like a refresher on some of the concepts that we went over. I'm going to be coding this all kind of from scratch. I'll start at the beginning and kind of like walk you through the code, and we'll see how it goes. I'm sure I'm going to make a ton of mistakes. Hopefully that will be a little bit enlightening to you as well as far as like debugging is concerned and stuff like that. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to start out with my folder over here. As you can see, we have kind of like our index .html that we're used to, a blank sketch file, and I've also included, of course, kind of like our P5.js library inside of the libraries folder. And then I also have a data folder with our data.csv. And you can call this anything you want. It doesn't have to be called data. But this is going to be our CSV file that we're kind of like loading into our sketch, right? So that's going to be kind of crucial that we kind of like know how to link to this. And first step is to bring our data into our sketch. So I am going to come up here and I'm going to start out again kind of like with our blank sketch. And we are going to have a function setup per usual, and our function draw per usual again. And this time we're also going to have, a function preload. And I'll get back to kind of what function preload does kind of as we go through this tutorial. So let's start setting up our variables. I'm going to have a variable called table. And this variable is going to load in some data. So I'm going to do load table, and load table takes two arguments. It takes data, the path to our data file, and it takes an optional argument, header. Right. So what does this do? So preload, again, is kind of a function that says load all of the stuff inside of this function before we hit the setup and before we hit the draw, right? You don't want your sketch to run and start kind of like trying to visualize data that's not loaded into your sketch yet. You'll get an error. So it's really good practice to use this kind of like preload function as kind of like a first way to bring the data into your sketch and ensure that everything is loaded correctly and that you're not getting kind of like untraceable errors because your data isn't loading right. Okay, so again, we have this kind of like load table function. It takes the path to our data, right, which is inside of this folder called data, and it's data.csv. And this should be pretty similar to you. This is again like kind of like how you link to like images or something along those lines. And it also takes this optional argument header, right? This is the data that we're going to be working with. I just kind of like made it up off the top of my head. We have a header for our CSV file, right? That says like the titles of the columns. So for this one, we're working with books. Each book has a title. Each book has a cover that has like a color associated with it. So maybe Frankenstein's like a red cover, and this cookbook's a blue color, and Ulysses is green. and a page number associated, or a number of pages associated with it as well, right? So let's see. Just as kind of a sanity check, I'm going to create canvas and do 800, 800. And in my function draw, I'm going to make a background, and that background is going to be black. And I'm just going to ensure that this is kind of like up and running correctly. This is up and running correctly, and it is. Right. Right, okay. So through the power of editing, I'm back. It looks like the thing that I'm using to record my screen was kind of like slowing down everything. Okay, so we're back. We have our sketch running. That's really cool. As another sanity check, I'm just going to make a rectangle really quickly. Sorry, I'm going to make a rectangle really quickly and draw. Right, okay, great. So now we have everything running. We also should have our data loaded into our sketch, right? And one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to do a console.log, and I'm going to console.log our table. And that should return a table object. So again, this is like kind of like a quick way to just like kind of debug and make sure that everything is running correctly. And console.log spits data back out to the JavaScript console. The same way that we would check like if there's like a bug in our code or something like that, we can do console.log and log whatever we want to kind of like back to us to try to see what's going on. So we have, it looks, right, so it returned a P5 table. And that P5 table has 3 columns. It has our cover, our title, and our pages. And it also has 3 rows. And if we kind of like continue to dig down in here, it has our rows associated with it, which is great, right? That's kind of like exactly what we were looking for, a P5 table with all of our data in it. And it, it has a bunch of other stuff. We don't really need to like worry about like proto and everything else. This is just kind of like a sanity check again to make sure that we're getting all of our data into our sketch correctly. Awesome, so that's great. I'm going to remove this for right now. Okay, so we have our data loaded into our sketch. And the next thing that we are going to want to do is kind of display it in some way, right? And we're going to do that with a class. And our class, I believe, was called bubble, and it has a constructor function, and this constructor function has it also has a display function because we're going to want to display it. And we were drawing ellipses before, so maybe we'll stick with that. Right, okay. So what does an ellipse take? It takes this.x, and we're going to have to set up our temporary variables again. So this.y equals temp y. We're going to give it a this.r for radius equals temp r. And we're also going to want to work with our data, right? And we have a cover, a title, and pages over here. So let's do this.cover equals temp cover this dot pages equals temp pages, and this dot, what was it, title equals temp title, right? So our constructor then is going to take temp x, temp y, temp r, temp cover, temp pages, and temp title, right? Okay, so we've kind of set up our constructor function. Again, these are kind of just like placeholder variables that allow our class to be like pretty flexible when we then go and display it on our campus. Okay, so how do we want to display this data? Let's say, so our ellipse is obviously going to take this x, this y, this r, and this r for the radius. We're also, sorry, forgot a comma. We're also going to probably want to display some text. And our text, we're going to want to display the title, right? So let's give it a this.title, this.x to put it in the x position. And let's also give it a this.y. And maybe we'll want to display some more text. So it has a title. Let's also display like what color it's supposed to be, just kind of like to debug. And maybe we'll like move it. We'll just space these out a little bit. So let's do like y plus 10 and y minus 10. And that'll just like give the text a little bit of space in between them so they're not sitting over top of each other, right? Okay. So maybe our bubble looks something like that. And we'll continue to kind of like play around with it as we move forward. But so let's start working with our data, right? So we have our preload function that's loading our data in. We're also going to want a function called load data. And this load data is going to, let's see, what is the first thing that we're going to want to do? We're going to want row equals, oh, right, we're going to want to loop over our data, right? So we are going to want a for loop where I equals 0, I is less than table dot get row count, which should give us back the number of rows in our table, right? We want to like loop over, write a for loop to loop over all of this data. So we want to have this I variable start at 0. We wanted to count up to the number of rows that we have in our table. So this get row count is much like when we do kind of like bubble.length or something like that, where we want to, instead of having like kind of like a hard-coded number in there, we want to be able to read all of the rows of our table kind of like dynamically, right? So if we add rows to it, we wouldn't want to say like 5 here, because if the number of rows in our table changes, we want that to be reflected in our code as well, right? So then I'm going to do I++, and I'm going to say let row equal get table dot get row I think that's right. And that will give us each row in our table. So let's also set up some variables to get the columns, right? And that's like where this header comes in, right? So we're able to, instead of like, say like row number 1 or row 0, we're able to say like, or I'm sorry, column 1 or column 0, we're able to say column cover or column title, right? So let's look at our data again. We have cover, title, and pages. So let's do let cover equal row.get cover. We'll do let title equal row.get title. And we'll do let pages equal row.get pages. Awesome. So now we should be able to get all of the data out of our table and into these variables that we can then like work with and kind of like play with as we want to. So we are also going to, so now we want to like draw this to the screen, right? So now we kind of want like, I'll put a variable bubbles, and we're going to want this bubbles to be equal to an empty array. And in that way we can like loop over all of the data in our table and kind of like take that data and like stuff it into each one of our bubble objects, right? We're going to want to create a bubble object for each one of the rows in our database, and we're going to want to like show that on the screen. So this is essentially like reading over each one of the rows, taking the data, putting it in a variable, and then yamming it into a bubble, right? So now we have an empty array, and now we're going to want to fill that empty array with our data. So we are going to do bubbles I equals new bubble, and this is nice. It kind of like pops up what we want in here. So how are we going to do this? We don't really have a lot of data to work with, right? Which was kind of like poor planning on my part. Maybe we'll in the future we'll want like some extra columns for kind of like an X and a Y axis to kind of like graph these in a way that makes sense. Right now, let's kind of like put them in like a random space. So let's just do random between 0 and 800 for the X, and random between 0 and 800 for the Y. Right, and then it takes a temp R, and we are going to make that let's make that the pages. Right, so that our bubbles, the size of our bubbles are reflected by the number of pages in our database. So let's do pages. Oh, right. So it's looking for cover first. Right, so this is going to be cover, this is going to be pages, this is going to be title. And again, we can kind of like look down here to this constructor function that we set up, and we see that we have temp cover, temp pages, and temp title, so that should make sense. And then we are going to want to display our data. So let's do another for loop, and we're going to do for let I equals 0, if I is less than bubbles dot length I plus plus, and we are going to do bubbles I dot display, right? Because we're going to want to display our bubbles. And now I'm going to save this. Let's see if we have any errors. We do. Length of undefined on sketch 17. Let me try to debug this really quickly and then explain. What I'm doing. Right, okay. So took a second to debug, and I was making a really stupid mistake. And that is because we've like set everything up. Everything looks very cool. Should be working correctly. But then I wasn't calling this function, right? I was never calling load data. So our data wasn't getting loaded. It was never running this function, right? So let's do that really quickly, and we'll save it. And wow, all kinds of errors. What is going on? And I also realized that I kind of like led you astray really quickly. Right. So we're getting a ton of errors over here saying ellipse was expected. It was expecting undefined for parameters, but it was receiving a string instead. Right. So what's happening? Let's take a look at our class and see what's going on. So we have this bubble class. We're giving it these things. We want the number of pages to reflect the size of the ellipse, but we're like kind of like not. We're not doing that. And I forgot, and I'm like, for some reason I don't really know why. I forgot about temp r, or like why I would want to use temp r, and I like don't really think that I want to, right? Like we want the radius to be defined by the number of pages and not by some like predefined radius that we're giving to our class. So let's delete this. I'm just going to remove all of this stuff, and I'm actually going to put pages here and pages here, right? So let me try to save this again really quickly. Awesome. Okay, so now we have some some giant bubbles, but we can see that it looks like our data is showing up, which is a good sign. That's kind of like step number one. It looks like they are being associated with some data points of some sort, which is also kind of good. Now we need to kind of like make it look good. Like let's make it look pretty. This is pretty bad right now, right? You can't like really discern what's going on at all. So, okay, let's take a look at this, and I'll try to think about how I want to do this. So let's take this pages, and let's scale all of it down. And I'm going to scale it down by maybe like 8. See how it looks. So I just took all of those and divided it by 8. And we can see they're put out at, in random places on the screen, which is fine, which is kind of like what we wanted. And they're kind of like scaled down, so that looks pretty good, I guess. It could look a little bit better. Let us next, let's use our covers are actually colors, right? So this might be like a little bit tricky, but let's do like a little trick, and let's like fill these with this dot cover. Awesome, right? So now, you know, Frankenstein is red, Cookbook is blue, and Ulysses is green, and it looks like that's being reflected in our data. That's pretty cool. We can't. It looks like we're like kind of like losing the text. So that's something that we could work on. Let's give it. Let's make this a stroke. And again, the stroke, like the fill, is taking a object and filling it with color. The stroke is kind of like the outside of the object, right? So let's give it a stroke instead, and let's say no fill. And that looks pretty good. So now the stroke is reflected by the cover of the book. The radius of the circle is reflected by the number of pages, right? Yeah, Frankenstein should be the smallest, Cookbook should be middle, and Ulysses should be the largest. That looks right. So this is looking, it's looking pretty good. This kind of looks like what we want. Maybe we want to like, let's give this like, plus and minus 20 just to move the text like a little bit higher and lower than it is originally. That looks cool. Oh, sorry, that looks good. I'll refresh again. That looks a little bit better maybe. And let's also give this text text align. I think it's text align in P5.js. Text align center. So now it's like right inside of the bubbles. This looks a little bit better. Maybe we want these bubbles a little bit bigger. Let's only divide by like 4. That looks pretty cool. Frankenstein is a little bit messed up, but I think that's something that we can deal with. And maybe I'll stop it right here. This looks pretty good. You know, I showed you code to kind of like hover over top of it, and that's something that you guys can play around with as well. That should be on our website in kind of like the tutorial that I wrote up for you guys. There are plenty of other ways, obviously, to kind of like visualize this, play around with it, make it look a little bit better. But again, just kind of like wanted to go through how we would go about reading this data in and visualizing it in some way, right? So again, just to like step back and kind of like reflect on what we did. We set up a table variable. We loaded the data in with the headers along with it. We set up our bubble, which is a class that we decided to write up with our constructor function. That should look pretty similar. And our display function that's going to display it in some way. We made our constructor function flexible enough and our display flexible enough to reflect the data that we're reading in. And we also set up this load data function. And this load data function, again, gets all of the rows in the table and and then per the columns in the table, kind of grabs that data, stuffs it in each one of these bubbles, and then in our draw, we're displaying it out on the screen. So I hope that was relatively clear. Maybe I'll make another video just kind of like circling back again and walking through like line by line. That was kind of hard to describe and code and think about the mistake that I made all at the same time. But maybe I'll do that next. Again, please shoot me an email if you guys have any questions or like shoot me a Slack or something like that, and I'm happy to help out. And that's it. I'll see you guys in class on Wednesday.